William, can you explain what IMF therapy, what did you mean by that? Does our listeners
Well, the International Monetary Fund was created in 1944 at the conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, when Roosevelt was president. And the idea of that, the conference was, the Bretton Woods Treaty was the arrangement of a post-war monetary order that would be a dollar-based system. That's important for people to understand.
Okay.
And that dollar-based system should be regulated by the International Monetary Fund, and one country has a veto right on that IMF policy, and that's Washington, U.S. Treasury. And therefore, whenever there's a Russia crisis, whenever there's an Asia crisis, the U.S. will bring the IMF in and say, okay, you have to privatize, you have to cut your food subsidies, like they said in Tunisia. By the way, that was one triggering factor for the street protests in Tunisia. At the time when Wall Street speculators were ramping up the price of grain to levels that it saw back in 2008, just at that time, the IMF says, Tunisia, you have to eliminate your state subsidies for food. Well, my God, talk about perfect timing for an explosion. The IMF was the instrument. So not many people realize that. So the IMF has been used as an instrumentality of U.S. economic domination since the end of the 1970s in Latin America with the debt crisis.
And in Egypt, it follows a specific pattern that you talked about in your book that the U.S. or the Pentagon has used to destabilize. I noticed that it followed a pattern you call swarming. Can you describe that?
Well, interestingly enough, the lead organization in Egypt coordinating these hit-and-run protests and so forth, these are very sophisticated things. One thing I told on a recent interview with the Russian television station was that even if you include the Russian Revolution with Lenin, there's never been a revolution that's been a genuine, spontaneous explosion of the masses that goes to a successful conclusion. They're all kind of orchestrated using mass discontent, and Egypt is no exception. So the organization that's guiding this is called Kafaya, which means enough. And that's one of those catchy words that was used in a color revolution in Georgia in 2003. Interestingly enough, the same people are in both countries, the National Endowment for Democracy, Freedom House. These are all CIA, U.S. intelligence, State Department front NGOs that run these regime changes all around the world and say, oh, no, that's not the U.S. government, that's these private NGOs. Well, they've been mucking around Egypt ever since for years, trying to create a post-Mubarak alternative. So they've been training youth, bringing them to Washington, meeting Hillary Clinton, and so forth. And the swarming element is really a technique that the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation, for people who don't know, is research and development. It was set up by the U.S. Air Force as a private think tank to develop future warfare ideas after the end of the Second World War. And the RAND Corporation did a study in 2008 of Kafaya, the youth organization that's coordinating al-Baradei's campaign, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood and all these other supposedly disparate groups, the Communist Party of Egypt, under one umbrella, get rid of Mubarak. And the swarming is the idea that these protests are coordinated by Twitter, by SMS, by instant message. And, of course, you have trained agents planted in these mobs that give the signal, and then it's twittered out so that thousands of youth then spontaneously appear to disappear from one protest site and go into another. They have satellite reconnaissance from the U.S. military and other devices that enable these key actors on the ground to coordinate these youth. So they call it swarming because it's like swarms of bees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's very hard for the traditional security services to defend against this because it's so spontaneous, apparently.
Right.
And the Rand Corporation has studied this for years. They tested it first on Charles de Gaulle in 1968 with the French May student revolution.
Yeah, mm-hmm. William, we're going to take a break on that note, and when we come back, I'd like you to finish explaining the swarming for us, but I also want to discuss the events of September 11th and how that precipitated the Patriot Act, and that really destroyed Americans' constitutional freedoms, all in the name of security. I think that's an important topic because of what's happening right now with them trying to get that passed again, and I understand it was not passed, but we'll see about that. So you are listening to Food Integrity Now with our guest, William Engdahl. We will be right back. Welcome back to Food Integrity Now. We have as our guest today William Engdahl, and he is discussing his book, Full Spectrum Dominance. And William, you were explaining to us about swarming and how that is used, especially through the social media route. You want to continue with that, and then we'll move on to 9/11.
Yeah. Well, basically, that's the central point, that these youth are brought out of the country usually, typically to, if not to the U.S., to some other country that has already done such a thing successfully. And they're trained, they're taught by the people who've done this previously in various color revolutions, as they're called. And there's a textbook that's put out by a fellow named Gene Sharp, who has something, strangely enough, he calls the Albert Einstein Institution up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard University is. And Sharp admitted in one interview that he calls it the Albert Einstein Institution to simply make it sound serious. But what he does is he's developed a handbook which has been translated into numerous languages where these color revolutions have been started, as a how-to manual for nonviolence as a method of warfare. And literally he uses retired Special Forces U.S. Army colonels, Robert Helvey among them, to teach these courses. So nonviolence sounds like Mahatma Gandhi and all these wonderful things, but this is really a State Department agenda of nonviolence to destabilize countries that don't do quite what Washington wants.
And that's because, as our image has to be one of promoting democracy, not one of going out and conquering the world or using underhanded strategies.
Well, the people who drafted the post-war order, which was called by Time Life magazine publisher Henry Luce back in 1941, the American Century, and the reason I call my book The Gods of Money, Wall Street, and the Death of the American Century is that the explosion of the subprime crisis in 2007 really marks the death of that project, the American Century, not the death of America, but the death of that project. And they literally said, we're not going to make the mistake of the British or the French empires. We won't call ours an empire. We'll call ourselves the defenders of democracy. We're spreading the free enterprise system. We're spreading colonial liberation from the old European colonial empires and so forth. Because Americans don't like to think of themselves as imperial people. They want to think of themselves as nice, good guys. Mm-hmm. So that was brilliantly, I have to say, it was a brilliant tactic to package this in this kind of propaganda wrapping. But if you compare it with the British Empire in certain ways, it's more brutal an empire than the British ever were with India and Africa.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think the whole agenda was behind 9/11?